Start.
Very good morning. Assalamu alaikum to each one of you. We are extremely happy that our honorable speaker, Professor Avijit Pathak, has already joined us, and our head of the institution, Principal Sir, has already joined us. Let me start with a little introduction of the program. Today's program, a lecture, is a part of a Gandhi Jayanti celebrations in our institution. We are also aware of the fact that in today's polarized world, it's very important to debate the relevance of people like Gandhi and his message and other relevant people. It's also important for any society to try that a complete trust among the members in the society must be developed. Wherein each of us has the freedom to express ourselves. Here I am reminded of a quote by Gandhi: "You must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is like an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean are dirty, the ocean does not become dirty." This is Manzoor Pare. I'm a faculty at Government Degree College, Ganderbal. I'll be moderating this program. For the formal welcome address, both to the speaker as well as the participants, I request our honorable principal, Professor Bashir Ahmed Pare Saab, for the formal welcome address. Over to Bashir Saab.
Okay, thank you, Manzoor Saab. Respected organizing committee members, the renowned speaker in the program, participants from various parts of the country. Very good morning to all of you.
You are not audible. Please
This today's program, it is a part of the deliberations of Gandhi Jayanti that have started in our college. Different types of programs, and this lecture is one of the
Manzoor Sir, we are able to hear the principal. We are able to hear participants.
The committee for this event have chopped program on the for the celebration of Gandhi Jayanti, and today we have with us a renowned speaker who will speak on the theme, the pedagogy.
We are not able to hear you, sir.
This video is not perhaps.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Is you okay? Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible?
You are.
Yes, sir, you are.
It is really a moment of proud and honor all of us to have with us a person of high intellectual repute, Professor Avijit Pathak, who happens to be renowned sociologist, a teacher at Center for Study of Social Science at JNU. Very happy that he accepted our invitation this occasion, and we are really happy to have our with us today, Professor Avijit Pathak, a renowned sociologist and teacher at Center for Study of Social Science at JNU. I welcome you, sir, for obliging us with your presence in today's program. I also congratulate the organizing committee members, Professor Manzoor, Professor Mehraj, Professor Ishtiyaq, and Asif Iqbal, arranging this session with Professor Pathak sir. have an overwhelming response from across the country, including institutions like IITD, JNU, Jamia Millia Jamia, Central University, Central University of Kashmir, besides the University of members from the University of India. We also have a good response from these colleges on this occasion. We all know that we are passing a period of stress and distress because of this COVID pandemic. But all of us try some or the other to overcome this stress level by some or the other way. And today the theme chosen very much relevant because of this ongoing pandemic, and we hope that we benefited from the expert talk to be given by Professor Pathak. I also extend my thanks to Centers of Ganderbal for extending their technical support, and they have also obliged us as and when approached them. Without spending any more between the participants and the renowned speaker, I hand over control to Professor Manzoor to set up formal proceedings the program, and let us listen to the expert talk to be heard by Professor Pathak. Thank you all. I welcome all in today's program. Thank you, sir. Or Manzoor sir.
Principal sir, for your kind words. We are in fact thankful to you for giving us an opportunity in organizing such kind of events.
Sir, is it going smooth?
I'm able to hear you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words.
Madhav?
So we will start the formal proceedings of the seminar. Before inviting our very esteemed speaker, I would like to have a few words about the speaker. It's a great pleasure for me actually to introduce today's speaker, who is going to talk about a very unique in a way topic, pedagogy of hope. We are aware of the fact that the world is in a very we know that is because of the pandemic. Under these circumstances, and especially in the domain of the teaching learning, it's important to negotiate the path and get hope even amid the hopelessness. Our today's speaker is none other than Professor Avijit Pathak. Professor Pathak teaches sociology at the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, from last more than 3 decades. He's an epitome of humility. The learned professor is because of his simplicity, and he has a love for the vocation of the teaching. Professor Pathak, apart from being a distinguished academician, is a regular columnist with some of the finest newspapers in India, like Indian Express, The Wire, The Tribune, and at the same time, Professor has written more than 12 books, and some of the most prominent books are Indian Modernity, Contradictions, Paradoxes and Possibilities, Social Implications of Schooling, Knowledge, Pedagogy and Consciousness, Modernity, Globalization and Identity towards a Reflexive Twist, Recalling the Forgotten, Education and Moral Twist. We are extremely thankful to the professor. He has actually given us consent to speak to a very, it's a rural college. We're extremely thankful to him that he has finally made it here. Over to Professor Pathak, sir.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Friends and colleagues, I'm really grateful to you for making it possible and to meet all of you, although online, and giving me an opportunity to interact with you. And before we formally begin, let me convey my best wishes and prayers to all of you, colleagues, teachers, friends, students, because quite an unusual time we are living in, and the pandemic has unsettled everything. Our taken for granted world has completely collapsed, and we are living with psychic nausea, psychic bewilderment, anxiety. And at that moment, a gathering of this kind and this meeting of kind is really therapeutic. And hence, I articulate my gratitude and gratefulness to all of you for giving me an opportunity to interact with you. Kashmir continues to fascinate me, and although online I am smelling all of you, I'm getting a glimpse of all of you, but I always long for a very direct, intimate, physical interaction with all of you. And I convey my best wishes to all of you. And let me begin. And I have been asked to initiate a dialogue or discussion on a very important and relevant thing, which as students, teachers, scholars, educationists, concerned citizens, we all reflect on education and essentially about hope. And so this conversation, as I have been asked to initiate, that is on pedagogy of hope. And that too, as part of the celebration of Gandhi Jayanti. And if we forget the ritualization of the celebration, but one thing that whenever we refer to Gandhiji, one thing that comes to our mind in a way as an embodiment of hope. And through that, I think that discussion on pedagogy of hope today has acquired a new meaning. And when I say that the moment we look at Gandhi and reflect on that, and it looks that he was an embodiment of hope. And why I say that, imagine the times Gandhi lived in, and imagine 1946, and Gandhi walking through the villages of Noah, which today is part of Bangladesh, and in a situation where it was almost everything was burning, and there was large-scale violence and the hatred among different communities, and Gandhi walking alone and trying to spread certain kind of sanity or speak the language of peace and intercommunal harmony and cross-religious cooperation and dialogue at a time when things were falling apart and there was fire, there was darkness all around. It looked like that in Noakhali, Gandhi was carrying a lamp of truth in a dark world. And amid that darkness, he was carrying a candle of truth and a candle of light. Likewise, at a time colonial modernity invaded and colonized our consciousness, because colonialism is not just the invasion of physical territories. Colonialism is also the invasion of human consciousness and human mind. So when colonial modernity invaded our consciousness, Gandhi was speaking a language of hope because he was trying to decolonize the mind and decolonize our consciousness. And also in a world where there was a large-scale violence, the world of war, totalitarianism, fascism, colonialism, and imperialism, in that world of violence, Gandhian utopia or the Gandhian project of ahimsa or non-violence again came as certain kind of hope in a world that was terribly violent, filled with war, technological violence, fascism, totalitarianism, and colonialism. In a world of this kind, non-violence as a mode of resistance, a new language of resistance that Gandhi spoke of, that came as certain kind of a hope. In other words, in Gandhi's time, we could see that in certain kind of darkness caused by war, violence, colonial modernity, colonial invasion of cultures, and large-scale communalism and the violence, Gandhi was emerging, and Gandhi did emerge as an embodiment of a new possibility, a hope. It was a language of sanity in an insane world. And that's why on an occasion of this kind, as we celebrate Gandhi Jayanti and this celebration, and I relate that to that central theme today, we are talking about pedagogy of hope. Possibly all of you would agree that when I come to that notion of pedagogy of hope as a teacher and educationist, and friends and colleagues, I'm not going to speak anything bookish. Things that I'm going to share with you, something that I have learned, experienced as a teacher, as a wanderer, as a seeker. And this is something I wish to share with you when I talk about pedagogy of hope. But I believe that all of you would agree that it is impossible to come to the question of pedagogy of hope unless we acknowledge the problem. And the problem is that it's a violent world. There is violence all around, and there is darkness all around. In such a violent, cynical, dark, how do we speak of hope? Where do we see hope? That is a question that confronts all of us. And just think of it, that how, as social scientists, as teachers and scholars, we see this darkness and violence all around. If we think deeply, we could see there are primarily three reasons for this, the all-spreading violence that we are experiencing. One, at a macro, global level, as we see, which was rooted in certain notion of progress. And that certain notion of progress was based on ecologically destructive, environmentally damaging gospel of unlimited techno-economic growth and progress. When the gospel of unlimited techno-economic growth and progress becomes the new mantra and the new religion in the modern age, in our times, it often causes, and what these days many social scientists are arguing, it causes a risk society. A risk society filled with the possibility of climate change, large-scale environmental destruction, and a very disruptive relationships human species and the larger ecosystem. And also it's a risk society filled with the possibility of emissions from the nuclear reactors, deforestation, large-scale environmental damage, and the violence. And this is what many social scientists would argue, one of the crises that the age of hyper-modernity with the gospel of techno-economic growth and progress has led to. Today, we find ourselves in a world of this kind where the climate change, environmental disaster, and large-scale technological violence have become the normal. And in a world of this kind, we see violence. Violence is in our orientation to development, orientation to progress, orientation to and the growth. And the second reason that even we could see is that in the post-socialist world, the neoliberal discourse of the individual, the atomized individual as a discrete consumer, driven by some sort of utilitarian hedonistic urge for what lot of new left philosophers as certain kind of a having mode of existence. Greed becomes desirable. Greed is normal. Greed is sacrosanct. I am what I possess. I am what I have. As Erich Fromm, one of the fantastic Frankfurt School Marxist theorists, would have said that we live in a world characterized by the having mode of existence. We seek to grab, we seek to consume. We consume not only Pepsi, soaps, and detergent powder. We consume sex. We consume desire. We desire desire only. It is in such a world that our existence today depends on what Fromm would have argued the having mode of existence. And another leading New Left thinker in a fantastic book called One Dimensional Man, Erich Fromm, would have written on the destiny of that man. Man has become one-dimensional. His only aim, it appears, is to define himself in terms of what he possesses. And that's why in the spectacular shopping malls, the language through which the hidden persuaders constantly tempt us, persuade us to buy all sorts of latest gadget and latest products, and to define ourselves in terms of what we possess, what we consume. In that culture of conspicuous consumption, there is inherent violence. We all have become today consumers, discrete, atomized. And in the age of consumption, we actually live in a lonely crowd. In that world, there is no ecstasy of human relationships. Long back, Marx characterized this world in a way, the early phase of capitalism, where Marx would have said, all the heavenly ecstasies have been drowned into icy water of egoistic calculation. Or in Capital Volume 1, Marx would have said that it's commodity fetishism. The relationship between you and me, the relationship between two human beings has lost its humanness. It has been objectified. It is a relationship between two objects and two commodities. And that is what he would call the commodity fetishism. So this is where, for example, we see our loneliness, the inner violence, inherent restlessness, our jealousy, our anger, our envy, our reckless desire to consume, to possess, to grab, to exploit. So this is where, for example, we see this reckless man driven by the desire to consume, and which is sanctified by the neoliberal discourse of consumer, of the consumption. And this is the reason for violence and the darkness that we see all around. And third, friends, many of you would agree, we are also living in an age in the 20th century that experienced two devastating wars, First World War and the Second World War. The world that experienced totalitarianism and fascism, Hitler and the Mussolini, and the Stalinist nightmare, Holocaust and concentration camp. Yet it seems that nothing we seem to have learned. The World War didn't stop Vietnam War. Vietnam War didn't stop Gulf War. Gulf War didn't stop Afghan War. And this war today is all pervading. In a world of this kind, we also are seeing the rising totalitarianism, the rise of the totalitarian state, and the rising totalitarianism, simultaneously the culture of narcissism, and simultaneously with this, we see worldwide, and what in a different context, Michel Foucault, in one of his texts, Discipline and Punish, would have seen it, the growth of the surveillance state. And as a result, the technologies of surveillance. Foucault did talk about the architecture, Bentham's panopticon, did talk about the telescope. But since Foucault's time, the physics has developed, the new technologies have developed, and the technologies of surveillance have become more refined, more sophisticated, more subtle. In other words, we find ourselves in a world where surveillance is normalized. Surveillance is sanctified surveillance is normalized and the technologies of surveillance surround our everyday existence. So we live in a world of this kind. Now, these are the three reasons, as I just wish to share with you, where we could see the darkness around us, the violence around us. And it is this violence that we experience every day. We see every day, we breathe every day. This violence is in the street. This violence is in the marketplace. This violence is on television channels. And this violence is in our politics. In our politics, we live amid this physical, cultural, psychic, symbolic violence. Now, in a world of this kind, and how, for example, particularly when we speak on the occasion of Gandhi Jayanti, a person who spoke of ahimsa and non-violence, a more peaceful, harmonic, egalitarian, ecologically sensitive world. Now, what do we do in a violent world of this kind? You and me, as teachers, as students, as scholars, researchers, concerned citizens, how do we look at ourselves in a world of this kind? And you and my look, as a teacher, as a student, as a scholar, what you and I could do. Could we rethink our pedagogy, rethink our education, rethink the way our children grow up, rethink the way we have looked at education so far? Can we do that? I know it is an exceedingly difficult task, but I at the same time believe that as teachers and students, a lot of young teachers and students who are here, it is an exceedingly difficult task, but it is important to undertake that task. And with that, I just wish to speak something about pedagogy. Now, before that, again, just think of it, and which all of you would agree with me, that there are two things that have happened in our dominant educational practices, in our school, college, university, classroom culture, and across from Delhi to Kashmir, from Kanyakumari to from Mizoram, come to any college, university, school, we could think about two pathologies of our education system, of our culture of learning. Now, just acknowledge those pathologies. Only when we acknowledge possibly a new pedagogy of hope, we could at least think of, we could at least conceptualize, theorize. Now, see these two pathologies. First pathology is essentially what lot of educationists, right from Rabindranath Tagore to Mahatma Gandhi to Jiddu Krishnamurti, many of them did repeatedly talk about. And also in the Western context, people like John Dewey and others repeatedly talked about. And that is that our education, the culture of learning today, has become merely very routinized, mechanical, graded learning. And it is assumed that the learning takes place only through the prescribed curriculum, prescribed textbooks. And the learning is something which Paulo Freire said very critically. In this system, we tend to believe that the all-knowing teacher would bombard the child's mind or see the child as an empty vessel, fill the child's mind with all sorts of theories, information, bookish knowledge. And this leads to what we often talk about, child as merely a consumer of knowledge capsules. And the child is only consuming and consuming geography and history, political science and physics, civics and English grammar. And as a result, as Tagore would have said, the child is a tape recorder, becomes a parrot, because this heavy burden of information that we are constantly bombarding, leading to a culture of rote learning, where through mock test, weekly test, monthly exams, and a very non-imaginative process of evaluation and examinations, children's ability to memorize and recall what is written in the textbook, that is being judged and evaluated. So we are already filling the mind of the child with what is called merely a bookish dead information knowledge. There is no ecstasy in that process of learning. There is no engagement with that process of learning. Engagement begins in a different way. Engagement begins, for example, take your child under the open sky, and the child looks at the open sky. Suddenly, child asks you that why is it that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? Why is it that the moon keeps changing its size? You know, that today there is a full moon, next day moon size is reduced. Why is it? And the child asks this question. And out of that question, out of that wonder, the physics of the solar system begins. And only when our classroom physics no longer remains limited to the blackboard and is integrated with the basic wonder that with which the child looked at the sky and asked mommy or the papa the question, why is it happens like this? Sun rises in east and sets in west. Or why is it that the sky is blue? Now, out of this question, but so soon we kill that one, we kill that innocence of the child with a heavy baggage of hundreds of books and meaningless home tasks and the summer projects. We have already killed the child. We have killed the child's imagination and the wonder. A great act of murder, a great act of psychic and cultural violence is all the time taking place in our classroom. Together with this comes what happens is that, which I would argue is that reckless process of comparison. And that comparison and the unique, and that comparison tends to negate the uniqueness of the child, uniqueness of the learner. Now, this is where, a great hyper-competitiveness and violence erupts in our classroom. Together with this pathology, which all of us experience, at another pathology, which is so contemporary today, and that is because of, once again, the neoliberalism. And social philosopher Jürgen Habermas characterized it as the instrumental
So we are not able to hear you, please. Check your internet, please, sir. Sir, are you able to hear us? Probably, sir. Sir, please unmute yourself.
Am I audible now? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, I think there was certain problem with the internet. Anyway.
Yes, sir.
So is it okay right now?
Yes, sir.
It's not okay?
Okay, sir, please go ahead. We are able to hear you. So we are able to hear you. Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
Everything is okay, sir.
Is it okay?
Sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Everything is okay.
Okay. Thank you. So the second aspect of the pathology of our education that I was referring to is that, as I talked about Habermas, the instrumentality of our age, when the market colonizes the domain of learning, colonizes the university. And as a result, what happens, that the market tends to define the relevance of what is worth learning. It is in that context, for example, if a graduate of hotel management or the fashion designing, the corporate gives a job to hotel management and fashion designing students. And for example, a student of history who has studied a great deal of Ibn and Romila Thapar, and that student of history It's not. Ambanis and Adanis are not interested in recruiting that student of history, because all that he has to learn is not related to the market interest, corporate interest. So what do you do? Should we reduce the fund in the history department or in the literature department, and we transform university into merely for market-driven, self-financing courses? As a result, when you see this trend coming increasingly in India, and then we could see, for example, what we would call the massive commodification of learning, massive commodification of education. And that commodification of education again causes its own violence, because it disturbs the relationship between the teacher and the student. Now the teacher becomes merely a service provider, and the students becomes merely a consumer of skills. And between the teacher and the student lies that heavy tuition fee that the private university or a private educational institution or a commercial institution grab and take. In a situation of this kind, the learning, the critical learning, the deeper purpose of learning and education, to think, to look at the world, to question, to reflect, to imagine possibilities, imagine new alternatives, to raise critical question. In other words, as Habermas would have said, critical and hermeneutic interest, understanding the culture, raising critical question, those aspects tend to disappear. And what becomes important is only the market-driven deals. So the key, we tend to reduce education into mere training. And we tend to think the purpose of education is essentially to create the future working force for the corporate. And this is where one of the ideal of the university as an intersubjective space of dialogue, debate, discussion, and the quest for foundational knowledge, the critical reflective debate and tradition experiences severe blow because of this marketization and the commodification. Now we see ourselves in a world of this kind. As students and teachers, we see it, we experience it every day. Now the question is that, is it possible now, as student and teacher, to now put forward, to strive for, to fight for another language, and which my friend has suggested, pedagogy of hope? Is it possible now, in such a devastating world of violence and the darkness, commodification and the market, is it possible to strive for a pedagogy of hope? I believe that if as teachers or if as a society loses its dreams, that society becomes dead. And if as a teacher we lose our dreams, then, for example, we become dead already. And teaching, if it has to be alive, if learning has to be an alive, deep experience, then it is important for us, even though we are passing through this darkness, to strive for a new pedagogy. And that pedagogy, we are talking about a pedagogy of hope. And this pedagogy of hope, as opposed to, as different from the pathologies of education that I just talked about. The way at one time, Gandhi's politics was a politics of hope in the age of colonial violence and modernity. Likewise, today, the pathologies of education that we see today, the pedagogy of hope, is alternative to that pathologies. We ought to strive for that. It is an exceedingly difficult task, but it is something that we ought to strive for and we ought to think of. And this is here. In that pedagogy of hope, I would just share with you the 4 distinctive characteristics of that pedagogy of hope, which I wish to share with you. And I believe nothing bookish. I believe that as teachers, you'd see some point in that hope. The I would argue empathy, empathy as a very important aspect of pedagogy and learning. What is empathy? Empathy means expansion of horizons. Empathy means elasticity of consciousness. Empathy indicates the possibility of a fusion of horizons. I seek to expand my horizon. I imagine myself in your position and I try to understand the meaning you are attaching to the world. It's like asking a question that I ask myself. Is it possible for me, sitting in a privileged location in the national capital, to expand my empathy, to imagine and to think what it meant for a Kashmiri mother when her son or daughter goes to the college or the university or the marketplace and does not come back at the right time? What anxiety a Kashmiri mother or a Kashmiri mother passes through. Now, am I or my student, can this empathy be cultivated that I have not met her, I have not seen her, her problem I have not experienced, but it's still possible for me to broaden my horizon, to expand my consciousness, to imagine myself in the position of the other. Empathy is a very important faculty of learning. In a world where there is so much binaries, so much divisions, so much dualities, and so much hierarchical binaries and dualities and stereotypes, in a world of mind, is it possible to expand, to cultivate the faculty of empathy as an aspect of learning? When we teach science, when we teach social science, history, philosophy, literature, humanities, and I often share it with students of literature that, for example, that you are reading Dostoevsky. You have not gone to Russia, the time when Dostoevsky was writing those great literature. But read deeply, carefully. Could you think that in a winter cold night, you are walking through St. Petersburg or you are walking through Moscow? Can you understand and imagine the existential agony that a Dostoevsky's character is passing through and experiencing? It is empathy that humanizes us, empathy that spiritualizes us. And one thing that has caused so much violence in our world is the absence of empathy. We are quick to judge. We are quick to stereotype people. We are quick to judge. We are quick to stereotype. Oh, he is this. He is like this. He is a Kashmiri. She is a Bengali. He is a Keralite. So we wish to stereotype. And the stereotypes cause is a block to communication. Communication is possible when I acknowledge your presence. You acknowledge my presence. And that is what existential philosopher Martin Buber would say, I-thou relationship, not the I-it relationship. As opposed to stereotype, as opposed to fixation, essentialism, objectification, now you and I try to understand. And empathy leads to compassionate listening. When militarization of the mind, the militarization of the consciousness, compassionate listening disappears. Empathy disappears from the world. And that is what has affected us. Our culture of learning. Teacher does not want to understand the student. The student doesn't want to understand the teacher. A Hindu student doesn't want to understand a Muslim student. A Muslim student doesn't want to understand a Sikh student. We live with binaries, dualities, rigid identities, and the fixed identities, and the expansion of horizon doesn't take place. And this is where, as I would argue, that empathy ought to play a very, very important role. Is it okay? Am I audible? Am I audible?
Of course, sir, you are audible, sir. You are audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. If there is any problem, please. So this is where the first I just want you to reflect on. Apart from that, empathy as an important aspect of learning, I would also talk about reflexivity. Isn't another thing of a component of the pedagogy of form. By reflexivity, I mean that it's not that you are merely a proud conqueror as a knowledgeable man, that with your Baconian science and the Cartesian rationality, you shape the world out there, conquer the world. Reflexivity is not an engineering mindset. Reflexivity is that as you begin to see the world, you also begin to look at your location in the world. In other words, the more you used to see the world, the more you wish to look at yourself. In other words, you seek to build a bridge between the self and the world. In other words, for example, how reflexivity becomes a very therapeutic process of learning as the pedagogy of hope. Now imagine, for instance, that that when a man like Marx was writing that commodity fetishism, that in capitalism, the relationships between human beings get commodified, objectified as commodities. Now, when I study that, study it only in a book, or also do I ask myself a question, that is it that slowly and slowly capitalism has also destroyed my humanity? Is it that I too have begun to see others as a commodity? I too have begun to see my son as merely a source of investment? I would put money in the coaching center so that my son cracks IITG entrance test to America and earns a lot of money. Am I also seeing my son as an investment, as an object, as a commodity? Or is it that my son has also seen me as an ATM, as a commodity? Youngsters often wear fancy t-shirts where it is written, "My father is my ATM." Now, had Marx been alive, he would have said, civilization can imagine a language of this kind only in a world of utter commodification, where father is the ATM and the child is the investment. Now, this is where the question of reflexivity, looking at oneself, and as a result, trying to build a rhythmic bridge between the self and the world, Now, this is where I believe is an important thing. Urvashi Bhattacharya's text, many of you must have read, about the partition violence and about, for example, the large-scale migrations and about the refugees. Now, for instance, now I have grown up in post-partition India, but is it possible for me, when I read Manto's tale of Sakina, what happened that night, Sakina's father, with Sakina and her mother, started the journey from Amritsar to Lahore. And in between, Sakina's mother was killed. And then, when Sakina's father, Shiraj, regained consciousness in a refugee camp in Lahore, and then suddenly see that Sakina could not be seen anywhere. And he would recall in between what did happen. Did the rioters come, and what did happen to her? When I read Manto, is it possible for me now to understand with an amount of reflexivity what would have happened to me? What would have happened to me had I too been in the position of Sakina's father and found myself wounded, violated in a refugee camp? What happened to me? How I would have responded, how I would have reacted. And this is where a self-churning begins to take place. And that process of self-churning gives a meaning to learning. Then Manto, or for example, Urvashi Bhattacharya, they no longer become merely a text for cramming in the exam. As learner, we begin to engage with. We allow ourselves a process of ethical, moral, political, spiritual churning, we begin to look at ourselves, at our own violence, at our own aggression, at our own greed. And the more we acknowledge it, and remember, Gandhi said it again and again, that how self plays a very important role. I just cannot fight the colonial empire out there. If I wish to engage in a practice of grow, I have to fight the enemy inside, my greed, my violence. And that's why Gandhi's insistence on the purification of the self again and again. So I'm talking about the reflexivity as a process of learning. Can we encourage our students? Can we encourage us as teachers to engage in that process of reflexivity, a reflexive learning? And that possibly would create a ground for certain kind of humanization. Now, each time the riots take place, that I often share it with my students, that read Manto, read partition stories, talk to your grandparents, talk to the people who had certain memories. What happened? What this kind of violence could lead to? What kind of barbarism it could bring in us? What kind of gender violence might take place? Do you wish to repeat that? Think of Holocaust. Think of totalitarianism, fascism. Do you wish to repeat the same story, the same tale? Or do you wish to create a new world, a better world? And I think these are the questions which ought to come in our classroom, in our interaction with students, in our interaction among our colleagues. And this is why we would teach, we would take then not only the notes of biology and history and physics, we would engage, our classrooms would become vibrant and alive, where learning would acquire a new meaning. So the empathy, reflexivity, and the third I would talk about care, what feminist scholars are fond of regarding as ethics of care. There is so much violence in the world. Even our techno-science is violent. Our engineering is violent. And there is no care. And that's why, for example, the development lobby would never understand what Avijit Pathak is talking about. Why she is against huge dams. Because for the development lobby, water is just electricity. Water is electricity. Water is not my, river is not my habitat. River is not the living of the Adivashis. River is folktale. River has no memory. River is merely a Baconian resource for engineering and the manipulation. And as a result, there is no care. And it is this absence of care that has led to such an ecological disaster, an environmental disaster. So the ethics of care, not only to the nature out there, care to each other, care to each other, care to human beings. Can we learn through care? And this is something that I often see. And I often ask my students doing PhD, I tell them, when you go to the field work, how do you look at the field? Do you see field merely as a mine? The way mining engineer looks at the mine to bring out the mining? Do you look at your field that way? Never forget that field is filled with human beings. And your task is not just somehow gather information. Your task is to engage with them, learn with care. And only when you learn with care, they themselves would reveal their stories to you. They themselves would tell their stories to you. Learn to respect, learn to listen, and allow yourself to be read by them. It is not only the field worker's privilege to read others. Allow the other to read you. Speak of your vulnerability. Have a cup of tea. Share moments of togetherness, jokes, laughter, pain with them. And only then the field begins to talk to you. The field no longer becomes dead, reified, objectified field. Field becomes human. Field begins to speak, talk. And this is where, as I would argue, the care, ethics of care. I am so violent, so arrogant. in our pursuit of knowledge. The simple fact that you have read 10 more books than me, and you begin to think yourself superior. And there is so much harshness, so much language of violence in our interaction, and that ethics of care, empathy, reflexivity, care. And fourth, but the most importantly, I would share with you is the religiosity of life. And when I speak, which is very, very, according to me, important, when I speak of religiosity of life, I'm not speaking of institutionalized, priestcraft, clergy-centric, organized religion. That might have its own importance. I'm speaking something else. I'm speaking of religiosity of life. The religiosity that emerges out of wonder, out of a search for a meaning of existence. Who am I? What is my location in this vast universe? Am it trees, rivers, plant, solar system, about this infinite cosmos? What is death? What does happen after death? What is life? Now, these questions are important questions, and a sensitivity to these questions. Techno-science alone cannot generate that sensitivity. Business management alone cannot generate that sensitivity. And this sensitivity, openness to this question, leads to religiosity. And it is this question that you would see bothered a lot of great minds. Leo Tolstoy writing, "The kingdom of God is within me." Dostoevsky writing a classic novel, The Karamazov Brothers, and where he enters into the interiority of human psychology and human consciousness. Questions relating to life and death, violence, meaning, sacred, and the profane. Gandhi engaging with a of this kind. And imagine, for example, when Rumi says that it is through love the king becomes the beggar. It is through love the dualities are transcended. And as one of the Rumi's fantastic saying, "What do I do, my friends? What do I do? My path is pathless, my trace is traceless. I am neither a Hindu nor a Muslim, neither a Christian nor a Jew. My path is pathless, my trace is traceless." And Jiddu Krishnamurti in the 20th century, almost speaking a similar language, truth is a pathless land. No fixed dogma, no particular sect can take me to the truth. Truth is a constant wonder, constant search. And that search and constant led Siddhartha in Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha, near the river. And Siddhartha asked the boatman that I wish to understand the river. And the boatman says, "Never did I find a man like you." Because all people believe that the river is an obstacle to be overcome. They wish to take the boat, cross the river, go to the other side of the river, go to the market, the office, the court. But nobody is interested in knowing the river and understanding the river. But Siddhartha's persistence, he wants to understand the river. And then for nights, Siddhartha, the boatman, waits near the river. And Hermann Hesse writes, one day, seeing Siddhartha as a seeker, seeing Siddhartha's calmness, the river begins to speak in many languages in front. And the river whispers in Siddhartha's eyes. And Siddhartha learns a great lesson about the continuity and the flux, about the temporal and eternal, about life and death. Now, these are deep questions of existence. And these questions of the religiosity of life, religiosity of man. Rumi or Kabir, Gandhi or Tagore, Iqbal or the Sufi mystics, many raised this question time and again. And I believe the sensitivity to that question is like, it's like monsoon in a deserted land. These are sacred tears. These soften the world. This humanizes the world. At a time when religion has been reduced into uniform, religion has been reduced into cacophony, religion has been reduced into aggressiveness, religion has been reduced into aggressive nationalism, into a discourse of war. At a time rescuing religiosity from manipulated religion. And the task of rescuing religiosity from manipulated religion, that technoscience cannot do. That is why a new sensitivity, and that is what I often communicate with my secular friends. I say that it is absolutely for you to be atheist, but it is not about organized religion. But how can you negate these important questions? And this is what a Buddhist monk speaks of, Vietnamese Buddhist monk, that I take a grain of rice in my hand, and when I meditate on that grain of rice, I immediately begin to meditate and contemplate that there are in a distant land, some farmer is cultivating that. And suddenly there are dark monsoon clouds and there are rains, and the farmer could cultivate that. And that crop, some driver brought it to the local market. And from the local market, my neighborhood shop, it has come. And from there I took it, and now I have cooked it. So in that grain of sand, I am connected. I'm connected with that monsoon clouds. I'm connected with that rains. I'm connected with that farmer who produced it. I'm connected with that lorry driver who took it to the local market. And I'm connected to the shop owner. It is this connectedness. And he said, that is mindfulness. And religiosity is about connectedness. Religiosity is not about violence. Religiosity is not about separation and division. And at a time, it is so important to learn, to tell it, to communicate it with our students, with our colleagues, and to tell it to ourselves, particularly at a time when religion has become a religion has become a militant language of aggression, orthodoxy, violence. In a world of this kind, how you rescue religiosity from manipulated religion? That's another important question, pedagogy. So these four elements, empathy, reflexivity, care, and then the religiosity, which I see could be the seeds of pedagogy, of a new pedagogy of hope, as opposed to an education that is commodified, that transforms us into mere exam warriors, that transforms us into mere objects of surveillance. A new learning, a new culture of learning, which liberates the consciousness, which humanizes us, and which enables us to strive for a better world, to imagine a better world. And only with this kind of education, and I believe it would be possible for you and me to switch off television channels, when in the television channels some star anchors spread poison. You and I would acquire the courage to switch off those television channels. You and I would acquire the courage to stop and to digest, to filter. We would not reduce ourselves as students of Watts University. We would retain our spirit, our criticality, our creativity, and your imagination. We would be able to distinguish truth from propaganda machinery. We would be able to distinguish organic leadership from culture of narcissism. We would be able to distinguish religiosity from violence. And we would be able to distinguish enabling nationalism from communalism. So that strength, that courage we would gain. And that is where education ought to play a very, very important role. It's an exceedingly difficult task. And I know that some of you would say that it is almost impossible. But I would argue that possibly, as we are recalling Gandhi today and where we learned, one of the important things about Gandhi is that, and I dare to speak of what I would say as an impossible project, that pedagogy of hope, because Gandhi strove for the impossible. Gandhi strove for the impossible. And unlike Savarkar and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Gandhi believed, like Tagore, the poem that Tagore composed, that India is an ocean, and in an ocean many rivers submerged, Aryans and non-Aryans, Hindus and Muslims, different faiths and the different sects. So in one of his fantastic poem in Gitanjali, he sees that as an ocean. And that's why Tagore's persistent critique of nation as a machine, as a monster, and he sees it as a civilizational flow. And Gandhi, unlike Savarkar and Jinnah, was imagining even in the turbulent 40s that possible for Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs to live together, and to live with solidarity, with brotherhood. And it was his faith, his conviction. And he, possibly for many, Savarkar, Jinnah, for many, Gandhi was striving for the impossible. Gandhi strove for the impossible. And I often recall Gandhi's last meeting with Rabindranath Tagore. And if some of you have looked at the visual at Shantiniketan, under the tree, Gandhi and Tagore talking about it. And just after a few months, Tagore's last convocation speech at Shantiniketan, 1941, Crisis in Civilization, where Tagore would again speak of the crisis that he was seeing in the world, the barbarism, the totalitarianism, the violence, the war. And Tagore thought that I would not lose hope in man, and I would imagine possibly a new dawn would arrive from the east. And such a beautiful bond between Gandhi and Tagore, despite many differences on Swadeshi, on non-cooperation, on many issues they differed, but there was so much of a trust, because their wavelength at the finest level, despite differences here and there, merged. And led Ashish Nandi to write a beautiful book called The Illegitimacy of Nationalism, where Nandi studied Gandhi and also Tagore's 3 novels and analyzed 3 lead female characters from Tagore's novels. And through that, Nandi evolved a sharp critique of hyper-masculine, aggressive, militant nationalism. Now, we are at a time of this kind. Now, how we talk about a new education, a pedagogy of hope, I just spoke of the seeds of that pedagogy of hope. And your task, my task, the task of this new generation of students is to nurture, is to give water, and to see that seeds get water and sunshine. And then one day it might become a tree of wisdom. And then we would agree with T.S. Eliot, one of the great poets in the 20th century, that knowledge is not information, and wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge. Wisdom is sanity. Wisdom is love. Wisdom is creativity. And that is highest learning, highest enlightenment. Thank you for listening to me, giving me an opportunity. Thank you very much.